Okay. Do I start all the way from the beginning? No. Anyways, so I mean, it's a little disheartening that people aren't coming back right away. But what we're seeing is that, this is what I've been saying to the churches, is it's going to take time. Because people are going to want to see other people to come, right? And they're going to see that they're safe and that nothing has happened before more people come. And isn't that kind of how evangelism works? Is that when they see other people do it, then they become a little more comfortable to exploring it themselves, the gospel. And then that's how we bring people in. And so my hope is that we'll see it. And that the folks that come continue to come live. Because it's going to be you folks that are, in a sense, the pioneers to come back, to be able to bring other people back. And so if I can encourage you in that way, my hope is that that's what happens. Now, a lot has changed since the pandemic. A lot has changed in here. That looks different. Now there's actually so I was at one church, and I didn't know where the camera was. Okay, and so I was like looking at the people. Because you normally you normally look at the people, and then I saw myself on YouTube, and I was like looking down the whole time, and so I was like, where is the camera? And when I went back to that church the next time and found out, oh, the camera's way in back up on top. So that was when I started to learn. Okay, when I come back to church and I'm speaking live again, to make sure I know where the camera is. And so I can see that the camera is right in front of me, which is awesome. I just want to say one thing else. I know MK had stepped out, but and my wife and my son didn't know this. The song that was sang at my dad's funeral was "God Will Take Care of You." And as I think about that song, now 47 years later, I remember taking hope in the words of that song, that even though I was only a middle school, junior high school student, with now a single mom who had barely a job, that God will take care of us. And now I think in hearing the words of that song again, I can attest to the fact that God has taken care of me and taken care of my family. And so we actually did have a small family gathering yesterday. And so more and more, we're seeing people come out of the pandemic. We're seeing people that are finally getting together face to face. And if you're out there, my hope is that someday you'll see, as much as it's comfortable and convenient to have church online, there's nothing that beats being able to come together face to face. And so my encouragement to you is come when it's safe, continue to explore, and my hope is that you finally cross the line and are able to meet people face to face once again. The message that I have today, and for those of you who have never joined a message that I've given, it always usually comes from the book of Luke. And the other thing that I try to do is I try to look at it from a perspective that was different from the perspective that I took when I was going through Sunday school or hearing messages on Sunday, to say, is there something else that's there that I haven't seen or haven't heard from somebody else? And every time I look at a passage in Luke, I find that there's something there that just makes me question, well, what about this? And today is one of those kinds of messages. If you saw in the passage, allow me to be able to describe it again. I'll flip through some of these slides. Oh, and the other thing that I wanted to mention is you'll see this big square thing, the graphic that's on the slide. This is what's called a QR code. Okay, and so if you're here live, you got a set of notes with the fill-in. Okay, now if you're a little slow like I often am, and I always get obsessed with making sure I fill in every blank that's on the handout, and so I remember there were a few times, because I was on the pastoral staff, where our pastor would give the message and he'd leave a blank empty. Because he either forgot it or didn't get to it. And I would always be obsessed with saying, you missed a blank. That's really important, is what I would say to him. So, I try to make sure that I have all the words that go in the blank. But as a special treat, now that we have new technology and we're all online and we can do QR codes, when you scan this QR code, so if you have a smartphone, you look at it to take a picture, what it'll do is it will then pull up a link that you click on the link, and then what happens is it pulls up the handout online. Okay, so you have it there on your phone. And the special treat online, the words are already filled in. Okay, and so you don't have to worry about filling them in. When we do it here in the handout, it's really for the kinesthetic folks, the kinesthetic learners who are just trying to to stay awake, and this is how they do it. Okay, is that they fill in the blanks. But if you have your smartphone, like I said, you take a picture, and I'll have this slide on almost every. I'll have this graphic on almost every slide. You'll be able to then download. So it's the same one. It'll allow you to download the handout for today. Okay. So as we look at this, I'm not going to actually read it again, and let me summarize the story. Basically what it's all about is it's about this guy who's a judge, and one of the things that it says about this judge is it says that he's a guy that doesn't fear God, nor does he respect man. In fact, Jesus calls him, he's telling the story, he says it's an unrighteous judge. And and basically it's two people in the story. There's a judge and there's a widow. And often we see in this story, when other people tell it, it's often a story about how we should persist to pray. Okay? If you look at commentaries, what you'll see is they'll say it actually is kind of about that. But there's more to the story than that. It also tells the story of what happens in the future, okay? And so it is a good story to tell that we should pray and pray regularly, just like the widow did. But there's some problems that I see if you just tell the story from the widow's perspective. And I wonder if every time we look at a passage in the Bible, if Jesus and a story, especially when he tells a parable, is he actually telling the story? Should we ask the question to say, which subject am I? Am I the widow? Is that what he's telling it? Am I the widow? And I wonder in this case, if I can cut to the chase, I wonder if we're not only the widow in this story, but we're also the judge as well. So there's a judge and a widow. The widow continues to come to this judge over and over again saying to give me justice. And what happens? He refuses. He keeps refusing. He goes, I don't care about you. I don't care about God. I don't care about doing anything that's right. I do what I want to do when I want to do it. That's essentially what the judge was saying. And so, but I'll tell you, this widow just keeps bothering me day after day after day. And it says here in this phrase, she will not beat me down by her continual coming. This is that phrase, beat me down. We know it now because in ESPN Sports and everything else, they talk about, a team got a beat down today. In other words, they got beat up really bad. Well, this phrase, beat down here, when you translate it, it actually means to be bruised in the eye. Okay, so it's actually something that really impacts the person that you're trying to attack. So basically, this judge is saying, I don't want to get beat, I don't want to get beat down. I don't want to get bruised in the eye, is what the judge is like. I'm gonna give you what you want because I don't want to get bruised in the eye. Okay? And this is what Jesus says. And the Lord said, hear what the unrighteous judge says. And he says, and will not God, then he goes on to say, God will give you all these things. So it makes it very clear, okay, well, we must be the widow, and we're praying, and God is the judge. There's a problem with that, though, that I hope you see. Why did he make him an unrighteous judge? It doesn't make sense to me that why would God characterize himself as an unrighteous judge unless he was also trying to tell us more of the story. And that's what I want to be able to share with you today, is what is God actually saying? Is it about persisting in prayer, or is it about persisting in everything that we do, in all the things that that we're seeing in society today? We've been locked up in the pandemic for more than a year and a half now. And since that time, it's been more than just the coronavirus that has been going on. There's been issues with the whole George Floyd incident that occurred and the protests that happened from that. There's been now hits close to home with Asian Americans being attacked more and more, especially elderly. And I during this time I kind of crossed over that line as I'm looking at all these ages of the people that are in the news saying that they're elderly, I was like, wow, that person's younger than me. I guess that means I'm an elderly now. And so I've started to be more careful about going out, especially at night, and being in surroundings that I might be the target, because I'm now the Asian elderly, and so there's been a lot of social unrest that has been going on. But as I look at this passage, I wonder if it actually speaks to things that we're experiencing right now. So allow me to make a few observations. And as you're looking at your notes, I'd like to be able to share with you this, is that the first observation I see that Jesus brings out in this story that probably we didn't catch because we're always looking at it as a story about prayer, is that injustice exists in every era. We're probably very fortunate in our judicial system today. As much as people say that our system might be flawed, it's nothing like that in other countries. I mean, basically you have to pay people off. I mean, of other countries with a very, unjust system that is out there. And so just like injustice exists back then, and I wonder if that's why Jesus pointed it out, is that injustice existed back then, and it exists now. And it exists now in our country as well. I know there have been a lot of protests about, the standing up for the flag salute or for the national anthem and all these things. And I heard a very different spin on it. For those of us who were alive in 1965, you remember that there was an Olympics that occurred somewhere. I think it was 1967 was when it occurred. In there were two American sprinters by the name of Tommy Smith and John Carlos. And it was during the time, actually, which I didn't put it all together, but it was apparently during the time of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. as well. And there was a lot of social unrest that was going on. And even during the Olympics, there was some attack on the Mexican athletes or something like that occurred. And it was John Carlos and Tommy Smith who took first and third, so they got the gold and the bronze in the Olympics for the 100-meter dash, that said, we have to do something that publicly demonstrates what is going on in the world today. And he got together, and it was not only to protest what was happening in the United States, it was also to protest what was happening in South Africa as well. It's like, they have black athletes, or athletes that are black, but yet they have coaches that are white. There should be some way of being able to, reconcile that. And so there were a lot of injustices that were going on in the 60s during that time, during that one Olympics. And because they couldn't decide on a way that they would protest to communicate all the social rights injustices that were going on in that time, John Carlos and Tommy Smith ended up putting on a black glove and raised it to the air when the national anthem was played, and it was taken as almost, I don't want to say out of context, because basically they thought that they were defying their country and that they hated their country, and that was not the case. They were looking for a public way to demonstrate, and because they couldn't, as athletes, come up with a standard way to do it, they said, well, we're on stand, we got to do something, and that was why they came. So often we mistakenly say, when we see demonstrations like this, that it must be because they hate the country, they hate our country. Maybe they should leave our country if they hate our country. And what I'm learning more is it's not about that. It's about the injustices that we continue to see in our country. But over time, let me say this, is that we need to accept that we're not going to address every injustice. And over time, we have addressed them. Allow me to be able to share with you some history there. In 1882, which none of us were alive during that time, there was what's called the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was meant to ban Chinese from coming into the country, or to vote, or to become citizens. After that time, and it was meant for a certain period of time, because they were saying too many Chinese were coming in. Okay, and it was originated, of all places, out of San Francisco. 10 years later, a guy named Thomas Gary, which you know very well because Gary Street is there in San Francisco. He actually extended it in 1892 to say, well, you know, we not only do we need this Exclusion Act continued, but we need every Chinese to carry a permit with them. And no longer can they go to court anymore. What's going to end up happening is if they have any injustice done to them, it needs to be a white person or a person that's white that will testify on their behalf. Chinese are not allowed to testify in court. Okay? And this was Thomas Gary, who, you know, we ascribe to Gary Street. So when you talk about national monuments, saying what is happening, it's like, well, will someone take care of Gary Street? Is what I wonder. But I bring up all these things to say there are injustices that have happened throughout our history. Okay, but over time, what happened was I think it was in 1940, they had rescinded the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it was at that time a guy named Warren Magnuson, who was a senator in Seattle, or a senator in Washington. He was the one that actually said, you know, we don't need this act anymore. However, it wasn't as great as we thought for Chinese, because basically what it meant is now 105 Chinese can come in per year. Okay, and it wasn't until I think it was 1965 that the whole Nationality Act to say, you know, because up to that point they said, okay, only so many people from this country, this country, this country, this country can come into the United States. It wasn't until 1965 that they had what was called the Nationality Act, which said you can't discriminate against people based on, you know, what country they're coming from. That there will be a certain quota for immigration, and that'll be it. It's not based on what country of origin they're coming from. And so all these things have happened throughout our history as a nation. Yet over time, we saw many of those things that we would have considered injustices that were eventually repealed. In 1965 also was the Civil Rights Act, and also for those of you, which is during most of our lifetime, in 1990 was what's called the Disabilities Act. For us, it would be unheard of to think that people were discriminated based on their disability. But you know, all those things happen for, if not during our lifetime, the lifetime of our nation. Does that mean we don't love our country? No. It means that injustices have continued to exist in every era. But we can't, and we can't fix them all, but we can persist to try to see them fixed. The next thing is just that we can prevail over injustice through persistence. Isn't that what the woman did, the widow? Basically, she knew that this judge was an unjust judge, but she continued to persist against him. And I wonder if that's also speaking directly to the whole idea that as we see injustices happen in our world, that's what the widow was doing. She was persisting, and in the same way, we can also persist as well. And as we continue to find those things that really are injustices in our world, I think our persistence, at least what I find in the scriptures, is that our persistence is both with God and man, making our petitions heard both day and night. In other words, not giving up. That's really what that was talking about. It's that rather than quitting, it's that not giving up on the persistence that we can have in addressing the injustices that occur in our world. But there's something else that I want you to notice, and this is why I put ourselves in the seat of being the judge as well, in addition to being the widow. It's this, is that the unrighteous judge neither feared God or respected men, which to me actually then would be the definition of what an unrighteous person is. It's a person that neither fears God or respects men. So it almost then gives you the definition of what righteousness is all about. Is that righteousness then is fearing God, and although they use the context of man, really it's respecting humans, respecting men and women, and we see Jesus asserted that in himself, in his life on earth. And so as I look at these observations, there's a few things that I want to be able to share with you today as to, how can we make ourselves more righteous? Okay, and often we think of a spectrum, or we think that they're two polar opposites. Either you're unrighteous or you're righteous. And I think if you look at most of the people that are counted as righteous in the Bible, every one of them sin. And so I wonder, is rather than righteousness being polar opposites, is it more of a spectrum? That we're constantly on this journey, that we're destined to become righteous. And that's the whole reason why I've made this message series about destiny. Is this whole concept that, we're on this journey to become more righteous. Allow me to be able to share with you just some thoughts. And if you can take them for whatever they are, but my hope is it helps you think a little bit more as we consider ourselves as both the widow as well as the unrighteous judge. Is what are the couple of things that we might be able to do to deny ourselves so that we can become more righteous? I think the first one is this, is that as we've been sitting in this pandemic, we've become, the conversations that we've been having have become quite political. We had an election this past year, right? And all the decisions that seem to be made seem to have some kind of a political bent, one way or the other. And what often happens that bleeds into our conversations that we have with each other. And so I wonder if, in order to make ourselves a little more righteous, to take a few more baby steps on that righteousness journey, is that maybe we could consider or catch ourselves when we're criticizing people that we don't really know. I've had this kind of happen at work, in that I work in an organization where the person who is the vice president is over this 2,000 staff employee organization. And they announced a significant reorganization. It involved her leadership team, which were like about 6 to 8 people, having to basically let go of the people, the whole layer underneath them, which turned out to be about 16 people. And then later on, they were given by our larger company organization another edict to say you have to reduce 5 to 7%. And so I knew this was tough on them, because I know of those leadership team folks. I know like half of them. And so the interesting thing that has happened now in companies is, because everything is virtual, what often happens is all this technology allows us to be able to give feedback in an anonymous manner. They have this thing called Poll EV. And what it does, it allows you to ask a question without anybody knowing who you are. Isn't that kind of the beauty of social media now, is you can say whatever you want without anyone ever being able to know who you are or any of that. And so, people were asking just terrible, the ugliness of, this is the way I characterize it, the ugliness of people really came out. And that what ended up happening is they were putting it on, like, do you guys know what you're doing? Are you guys idiots? It was all this kind of talk. And these poor leadership team people, especially the vice president lady, was having to be on the front lines and answer it. And yes, that is their responsibility. But, I kind of wonder if they were criticized, and people would ask me, well, what do you think of all this going on? It's like, I'll tell you. I know half of those people, and I know they're good people. And so, for me to be able to criticize them for what's going on, I'm sure they had, I'm pretty sure they had good reasons for doing it. And I remember emailing this vice president, because she knows who I am. And I said, Karen, I just want to let you know, thank you for being the leader that you are. Thank you for taking us serious. I know it's not easy, you having to let people go, and I've been on both sides. And, I know it's agonizing for the person that has to let someone go, as well as the person that is let go. I just want to let you know, I'm praying for you. I'm hoping whatever I could do to support you. And I remember she responded back, thank you so much, for that. I really, you touched on all the things that have been going on. So, it's gotten me during this time really thinking, how often do I criticize people that I don't know? And I do it a lot. I think you do it a lot as well. And can we perhaps catch ourselves when that often happens? And maybe make a few more steps towards righteousness when we do. The next thing is this, is as I'm learning from leaders, and I do a lot of reading of leadership books and stuff, and one of the things that I'm learning is that a leader has to be kind of above it all, and that means he doesn't get even. But our themes that we often have, especially like if you were like me as a kid, I watched a lot of kung fu movies, right? Every kung fu movie had some type of revenge aspect to it, right? And so it's been ingrained in our psyche that we must get even, right? And I wonder, I don't see anywhere in the Bible that talks about really us getting even, and so I just wanted to be able to call that out. But the next thing, and I think it's the final thing, is this, and how this kind of all dovetails into it, is I wonder if we can become more righteous and deny ourselves by suppressing those impulses that are really triggered by our selfishness, and rather than our godliness. I think for those of us who can think of a spiritual mentor in our lives, that it was a person that pursued godliness, and it wasn't a person that tried to get even or that criticized people or did any of those things. And I wonder, as we admire the people in our lives that are our spiritual mentors, is that maybe that's our path towards godliness. That when we fall into those aspects of criticizing others and getting even, isn't it driven from our own selfishness? And so I offer these up to you as ways that perhaps we can be more righteous. You say, where is that in the context of this parable? I think it's in the context of this parable when we talk about this unrighteous judge. Remember, he didn't fear God, and he didn't respect men. Who did he respect? He respected himself. And then some final thoughts to share with you is, as we think about this concept of righteousness and pursuing righteousness in our own lives, I wonder how we can follow Jesus in terms of the way he lived a righteous life here on earth. And I think it's these things. The first thing is practice engaging those who aren't like us. I've been driven probably these past few weeks by hearing a phrase that a pastor had said. And strangely enough, this pastor who said it was he was a guest speaker at the organization that I work for. So this was not a spiritual context. It turned out the reason why they got him is because he wrote this and sang this famous song that everybody knew. I think it was back in the 80s or 90s. But he became a pastor, and he said something in there that I think is applicable in so many ways. He says proximity, proximity changes perspective. Proximity changes perspective. When you're close to somebody, what happens is you no longer think of them as that group of people anymore. In my work context, if you were to look at the people that I associate with, they're nothing close to who I am. And I've been blessed in that way. And I remember growing up as a kid, we actually had a neighbor on the one side that was black. It was a black family. And then the neighbor on the other side was a white family. And I remember in that context, it gave me a greater appreciation of what it was like to live in a multiracial community. And I wonder, as we look down the street or look at our social gatherings, are we just hanging around with people that are just like us? Is there an opportunity to hang around with people that aren't like us? Isn't that what Jesus did when he hung around the tax collectors, when he ministered to women? It weren't the people that the disciples were normally used to associating with. The next thing is this. I wonder if we also need to, in order to follow Jesus and become more righteous, is that we become more of a giving culture rather than a taking culture. One of the things that I'm also seeing in industry today is they're trying to build up this whole aspect of helping others. Okay, it's like, That's right out of the Bible. That, you guys should just come to church, and you'll be able to learn about how to build a helping culture. And what we're saying is there's even a book out there called Give and Take. It's a business book to say, there are a small number of percentage of people that are actually givers. Most of our world are either what's called takers or matchers. In other words, you give me something and I'll come up with something equivalent to give back to you. And I wonder, that's counterintuitive to what Jesus did. He gave without expecting anything in return. And if we embed that in our culture, could that possibly take us towards that journey of righteousness? And then the last thing, which may be somewhat controversial, but hopefully I can explain it, is that we need to practice persistence. Jesus was persistent. Remember in the Garden of Gethsemane, he prayed persistently. But I added the other thing, is 2 times a day. Okay, and you're thinking to me, why'd you add that? Well, because it was in the passage itself. But what does 2 times a day could it possibly mean for us as we try to live out our Christian walk? I think it kind of means this. Day and night means I'm not going to quit. I think that's the first thing it means, is that as I get involved in something, I'm not going to quit. There's yet another business book, if I can share with you, one last one. It's written by a lady named Angela Duckworth. She's actually from this area, San Francisco Bay Area. She went to Cal. She's Asian, so her name is Angela Lee Duckworth. Wrote a book called Grit. Okay, and in that book, Grit, which is a bestseller one of the bestsellers amongst businesses, she talks about grit. She was apparently a business consultant, ended up becoming a middle school math teacher. Okay, and when she was a middle school math teacher, she realized that IQ wasn't what made her math students successful. What she found out was that it must be something else. And so she did a study, and that study apparently found that, and the study was based on this. It was based on students that were juniors in high school. It was also based on athletes, what allowed them to be successful, and it was based on, of all things, spelling bee students. And for those of you who haven't been keeping up with the spelling bee, the winning word was Murraya, Murraya, Murraya. Okay, and it's actually a plant in Southeast Asia, is what I understand. And so they're like, what is it? What was the formula that helped these people, athletes, spelling bee students, high school students, to be successful? And she characterized it as something called grit, G-R-I-T. She said grit is basically passion plus perseverance. Passion plus perseverance, which we're talking about here in terms of persistence, that they were willing to keep it going. Now, the reason why I wanted to share with you that is Angela Duckworth actually has a very interesting practice that she has in her family. She says, I want you each year, she says to her husband and her kids, it's like, each year I want you to come up with a challenge. And in that challenge, so take a new sport, learn a new class, all these kinds of things. I want you to explore, to challenge yourself so you can build what we're calling now a growth mindset. In other words, that you're continually learning. There's only one rule to that, okay, is that you got to, and that is when you take something else, that whatever that challenge is for the year, you can't quit. In other words, if you go out for volleyball, you make the team, you've got to finish the season. Halfway through, you can't say, okay, I'm no good at this, I'm going to quit. And what she was trying to do, what they were doing as family, is they were trying to build this culture of persistence, of grit in what they do. And I think about that in our own context. Is what are the things that we challenge ourselves, whether it's spiritually, emotionally, physically, that allows us to build grit, where we don't give up. That's actually what the 2 times a day was talking about. It wasn't talking about, that we methodically had to do something. It was the whole idea that we're going to see it through until it ends. Okay, and so basically in the Angela Duckworth case, she's like, after the season's over, you can quit at that point. But you can't quit halfway through. Okay, so if you're taking a class, you got to take it all the way through until you fail or whatever ends up happening. Okay, but you just can't drop out. Okay, and I wonder, what are the practices that we can embed grit in our own life? You know, that, or the 2 times a day that says, I'm going to see it through until the very end, until that course of whatever it is over. I think that's what it's talking about. The second thing I think it talks about is this, is as we think about 2 times a day, often we go to God 1 time. At least I do, you know, in the beginning of the day. You know, I'll do my Bible reading, I'll do my prayer, you know, and then in a sense, we often don't think about God the rest of the day. And I wonder if it's also speaking to that extra time that we need to also embed within our day, that it may not be a study of God's Word or a communication with Him, but perhaps it's a reflection of how God has worked in our lives. Maybe at the end of the day, and so you know, as I get older, I'm finding out it's harder to sleep these days too. One of the things that they say, you know, that as you close out the day to kind of wind down, is think of the 3 great things that have happened today. You know, and as you think of those 3 great things, it calms your mind down. So hopefully you'll be able to sleep. I wonder if that's a practice that perhaps maybe the 2 times a day is also speaking to, is that in addition to communing with God, it's just reflecting on what God has done at the end of the day. If we did that, that perhaps maybe that gets us going, that closes out our day, but gets us going for the next day, that embeds this whole practice of persistence that we see. And so my hope today is that I've given you some thoughts that as you leave today, or as you shut off the Zoom or the YouTube that we have today, that you would be able to say, now as I engage the world today, how can I embed persistence in my life? What are those things, the challenges that I need to have, where I could say, I'm not going to quit. I'm going to continue to move forward, because as the widow persisted, so I need to persist. And also as the unrighteous judge, which we also feel as a double character, so what are those injustices that are happening in our life that I can persist towards and be able to support as well? Let's close in a word of prayer. Our God, we thank you for this time. We thank you for what your word has to speak to us, and often we never know it all. In fact, we know very little of what your word has to say to us today. And so I just pray that for the folks that are watching online, for the folks that are here, that are present today, that you would bless them, use them mightily for your work today. Help them to persist in whatever the challenges they have going on right now. And help them to be able to call out those things that are injustices in our world. And we thank you that as we do have injustices in the world, that there have been steps and improvements that are made. But they've been made by people that have been courageous. Allow us to be those people that won't give up, to be the courageous people that can move on to see changes, not just for our society here, but for the future societies to come until you come again. And so, God, I thank you for the time to be able to share your word. I pray, Lord, that the insights that we saw today would be ones that would resonate with our folks today, that they would continue and build upon their goal of being fully devoted followers of you. For we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.